because we got through a good bit of this content, I think that, and we have a fairly short lab today, so if I need to take a little bit of lab space, but I think what I'd like to do is cover speech also today. I'll finish this, cover speech. And so if you check your email, I just sent you a form. Oops, maybe. No, it said it couldn't send. That's what happens when you show this. But it's a form for you to fill out to, there you go. Did you get anything from it? No. Anyway, I want to know if you want to have Thursday off and then do the vestibular system next Tuesday and then the review session in the lab was the plan, or if you'd rather me go ahead and cover the vestibular system on Thursday in class and we just do a review session on Tuesday. That way you have all the material for the exam before the break. So I'm just going to send you that form. Click an option. I'll be right back. I'll take a half sec. Hopefully you got that. Now, can I check it around here?
We got it.
You got it?
House green, 506, lab reports.
I'm not done.
Well, yeah, that'd be kind of crazy.
It's all right, did everybody vote? Vote now or else you don't get a vote. Of course I can't see that. All right. So, come on, there. So the overwhelming percentage is to do the vestibular system on Thursday, so you have all the material, and then we'll do a review session next Tuesday, and you have your exam that Thursday when you get back. Good deal?
So the review will be in place of class on Tuesday?
Yeah, and then we won't have lab on that Tuesday. All right, cool. temperature shift and some environmental sounds. And we had talked a little bit about auditory localization in terms of the three different cues that we use, right? So interval time difference, intensity differences for high frequency sounds, and phase differences for low frequency sounds, and the role of the superior olivary nucleus in generating that labeled line output of where stuff is, at least on our azimuth, right? With the interval time difference. So, how is the primary auditory cortex organized? By frequency, by tone, right? So it's all set up to do frequency detection, which is really important because that's how we know what the sounds are. So it's organized to know what sounds are, but not necessarily where they're coming from, right? So that ends up, frequency detection is important, but the auditory localization is also playing a role in primary auditory. Primary auditory, of course, also play a role in auditory localization. And there are non-primary, so secondary auditory areas that are specialized for detecting where sounds come from. So the primary job of primary auditory cortex is frequency detection. Big job of secondary auditory cortex is localizing sounds. All right, excuse me. So we know that there are cells, we can measure cells in the primary auditory cortex that receive that input from the superior olivary nucleus about the labeled line signal for what degrees sounds are coming from, right? But there's also some convergence to form receptive fields. And so I don't think that we have a really good understanding of how all these things get integrated, but what we know is we can go in and measure from a cell, and that cell will fire anytime there's a sound in that part of this hemispheric world, right? In this part. And if the sound's coming from down here, it's not going to activate that cell. And we can find other cells that are tuned for other places on this sort of 360-degree sphere around us. So, there are other intraoral detectors that do, so this is one that's doing not only azimuth, but it's also looking at that DTF to know elevation in here too, right? This is a cell that is responding to not only the location, right? So it's firing the most in this area and it's firing the least in the opposite area, so like a tuning curve, right? As the sound moves around the head. But it also is firing to distance as well, which we know less about how that happens, but there's a best distance for where that sound is located. These other neurons in the non-primary auditory cortex also play an important role. So we can measure directional movement neurons that are labeled line for a specific direction. So just like we talked about in vision for motion, if a neuron fired for moving from left to right, it did not fire for moving from right to left. So direction-specific movement of sound. And these primarily are found in the non-primary, that's what the NP is, non-primary auditory cortex in the right hemisphere. Right. And that's because what's in the non-primary auditory cortex in the left hemisphere? Language, right? So and we'll talk more about that. We'll talk more about that in this next lecture. All right. So in addition to having labeled line neurons that respond to specific features, a specific place, or a specific direction of movement, we also have cross fiber pattern neurons called panoramic neurons that, depending on what angle the sound's coming from, they fire with different patterns. So this is kind of a weird way to like represent this that the textbook did. But essentially what they're saying is 0 degrees, 60, 120, 180, negative 120, negative 60, and back to 0. So essentially what they're saying is if we're measuring a response from this panoramic neuron, for the 0 degrees, there would be like 2 action potentials there. For 60 degrees, there would be 1 action potential there. For 120, there's 1 action potential there. For 180, there are 3 action potentials there. For 120, there are, it's a pattern like that. So essentially, those dots sort of represent action potentials like I was drawing them here, okay? And so what you're seeing is that depending on what azimuth that sound's coming from, this one neuron is firing with a different pattern that represents that place in space. And that's what panoramic neurons do. Think about panoramic, they're representing the entire structure within a cross-fiber pattern of firing, right? And then we're not going to get into species differences, but there are big species differences in terms of predators in particular and how they're able to localize with hearing and that sort of thing. So some animals have better auditory localization capabilities than we do for sure. So we primarily use vision for that. All right, so that kind of wraps up localization. We're going to talk a little bit more about environmental sound, and I mentioned this last time when we talked about direct and indirect sound. Direct sound is sound that's going to travel directly to your ear. And so when you're outside, there's less surfaces for sound to bounce off of. So we get more direct sound in an environment without a lot of walls. In an environment like this room, with hard surfaces and walls, you're actually getting a lot of indirect exposure because the sound is bouncing off of the various surfaces, and that's going to make my voice sound differently in here than if we were outside lecturing, right? So this is influenced by the distance, right? The closer you are to the sound source, the more direct sound you get, the less indirect. And it's influenced by the setting, right? And this is where we can have things like acoustical engineering to try and increase the quality of the sound and decrease the diminishment of that sound. All right, so a little bit about indirect sound.
So can you please answer my original question? Why does it sound different when we speak outside than inside?
Put on your headphones so that this demonstration isn't contaminated by the uncontrolled character of the room you're sitting in. Alright, imagine a scenario with the source and receiver outside, in a free field with no reflecting surfaces nearby. It would sound something like this.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Now, put a few walls in.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Now enclose it totally.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Can we play those again?
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Now listen.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
And then obviously here you have that echo effect.
We can watch the sound move through these enclosure conditions using ray tracing. We'll use the ray, or line, model to represent sound. Though it omits the frequency differences and multi-directionality content of sound, this is good for showing propagation and reflection. Starting with the free field, we can model the paths the sound takes from the source to the receiver.
That's it? mean, just a straight shot?
Yep, the free field is an anechoic environment.
Wait. What?
Without an echo.
Ah, okay.
In the absence of reflecting surfaces, the direct sound is the only kind of sound arriving at the listener. It arrives at the listener sometime after the source creates it, the delay pursuant to the distance between the source and the receiver. And with a single surface added, say the ground plane in an outdoor environment, we see the direct sound followed by the reflected sound off the plane. Adding a second reflective surface, we see the direct sound followed by reflections off the floor and wall. They've arrived later than the direct sound because they've traveled farther.
Right, because the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line.
Right, so the reflected sound arrives later than the direct sound. Also, some of the sound energy has been lost to the surfaces, sound transmission through the material, and sound absorption in the material. So the reflected sounds not only arrive later, but weaker. The sound has undergone the twin phenomenon of time and attenuation. In this case, we've chosen smooth concrete as our simulated surfaces, so only a tiny portion of the sound impinging on those two surfaces is either lost to transmission or absorption. Almost everything, then, is reflected.
Yeah, 98%. So 2 surfaces begets 2 reflections.
No. We've only looked at the one bounce reflections, called first-order reflections. There are reflection paths that include more than one surface. Well, let's look at second-order reflection.
Well, that arrives later than the first-order reflections, because it's traveled farther, and is weaker than the first-order reflections because it's hit 2 surfaces instead of 1.
In this case, yes. On average, higher-order reflections are weaker and arrive later than first-order reflections.
All right, one thing I want to point out about that is that these lines are going really slow, but the sound is literally traveling at the speed of sound. Right? That's the whole thing about the speed of sound. So this difference, right, is very minute. Right? They're making it look like, oh, it's bouncing and gets there half a second afterwards. But no, but you can hear the tonal quality change, particularly in this setting, because these these frequencies that are arriving later are not only less in amplitude, but they are less in phase. So higher frequency sounds get absorbed more, and so you add like a bass richness, a tonal richness, when you have these walls as opposed to just the outdoor direct, because of the enhancement of those low frequencies from those secondary arriving ones, right? And then obviously when they put all the walls up, the sound bounces around enough, right, that you're getting that echo.
Multi-order reflections until the sound level of the reflections, weakened by successive impacts on the surfaces that absorb sound, is either below the noise floor in the room or below the threshold of hearing altogether.
So normally, our brains are really good at suppressing that secondary sounds, or secondary sounds are matching them up so that we don't hear an echo, And so when we have simultaneously produced tones, right, they become fused together. And this is what we talked about, how surround sound or speaker systems work when you're watching TV, is that if the actor is in the center of the screen, right, then his voice is coming out of the left and the right side speakers simultaneously, and that's fusing and creating a perception. And as we now change the delays between those speakers, we can shift that perception towards one speaker or the other speaker. And that's how they do that with these very, very small 1/10 of a millisecond to 1 millisecond time differences to cause these changes, right? The precedence effect, right, is where, and then if we have a delay longer than about 5 milliseconds, that's when we hear 2 sounds. Right? That's when we generate an echo. So within 0.1 to 5, we're having fusion of the sound between the two ears, and as we exceed about 5 milliseconds, we start to hear the second incoming sound, the second vibrating sound. The precedence effect is where in this range, somewhere between like 1 to 5 milliseconds, even though we have two sounds that are coming out of here, our brain only hears the primary sound. It doesn't hear the delayed sound. So there's like a suppression of that second sound that up to about 5 milliseconds. And then once we exceed that, the brain's ability to suppress that, we hear two sounds and it becomes an echo. And this is based on the fact that we're constantly having these secondary or tertiary sounds that are coming in from indirect reflected sound. So we can measure an interval time difference and a threshold for fused sound perception between two speakers, precedence effect, where we only hear the sound from one speaker because we're suppressing the second sound in that window, and echo, where we've exceeded now the ability of the brain to suppress that sound, so we have two sounds present. All right. So, when we talk about the auditory scene, we're constantly being bombarded with sounds, right? It's not like these examples where we're seeing a single sound source or a single tone or frequency. And this is the way our normal environment looks like, right? There's people talking all around us, we have environmental sounds that are coming in, and we're having to segregate an auditory stream that we want to focus on, that we want to pay attention to. And we can shift that attention and eavesdrop on the people that are talking behind us and tune out the people that we're having the conversation with, right? By changing where our attention is. All right, so this ability to isolate sounds in the environment and focus our attention on is called auditory segregation. A little bit more about acoustics. Different concert halls are designed to have different direct and indirect sounds, and that then creates a unique sound experience in those environments that are engineered for their acoustic presence there. So here we see two places that have very good acoustics, but look very differently, right? Boxy, lots of hard surfaces in the Boston Symphony Hall. At the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, not many straight surfaces, a lot of curved surfaces, and a lot of not flat surfaces here, surfaces covered that are not as hard, that are softer. All right, so we've talked about this, that indirect sound is influenced by architecture. And the closer direct sound is, the more attention we pay to that. All right, one more video on this.
Hi, I'm John Calder of Acoustic Geometry. Let's talk about acoustics, which is basically how sound works in rooms. It may seem complicated, so let's make it simple. Most rooms have flat walls and flat ceilings, and sound bounces off of these. So how does that affect the sound? I'll use these two Nerf guns to demonstrate. I've got this one aimed, so this disc goes directly to the ear. That represents direct sound. I've got this one aimed, so that disc bounces off the wall, and it represents reflected sound. I'll shoot them both at the same time. Reflected sound arrives at our ears later than direct sound, even though it started out at the same time, because it's traveling farther. And this wall is only one flat surface. There are at least 6 in the average room, and that's a lot of reflected sound. But why is reflected sound bad? I'll demonstrate using these two identical patterns. The blue pattern represents direct sound waves, and the red pattern represents reflected sound waves. They start out together, but when I move the red one backwards, like a delayed sound reflection, it creates destructive interference patterns, which changes the original sound wave. Here's the problem. Original sound waves are distorted by strong, later arriving reflections. Also, sound travels really fast, about 1,130 feet per second. A sound wave will bounce back and forth between these two walls about 60 times in 1 second. Sound travels so fast, it fills a room almost instantly, and this is only one bounce angle. Every room has thousands. How can we make our rooms sound better? Remember our Nerf guns? I'll shoot these at the same time, again representing a sound wave bouncing off a wall. Both discs bounce together in the same direction, which means the reflected sound is at full strength. Now let's use the first of our 2 acoustical tools, an absorber, to reduce the strength of sound bounces. To a sound wave, an absorber looks a little like a hole in the wall, so some of the energy doesn't come back. An absorber works by reducing the strength of reflected sound that would otherwise cause more destructive interference. But if we use only absorbers in a room, it makes it sound dull and unnatural. Historically, humans don't like overly absorbent rooms. So, let's use the second of our 2 acoustical tools, the curved surface diffuser. It also reduces the strength of sound bounces. A diffuser works by scattering the sound reflections in different directions, smoothing out destructive interferences throughout the room. Room acoustics are greatly improved using a combination of absorption and diffusion.
Do you hear the difference there?
It's all about reducing those flat surface reflections. Use a combination of absorbers and diffusers, and
All right, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of understanding of why you see those funny shapes, why things might be curved, and how those padded sort of walls can help reduce the indirect sound. There are 4 sort of major components, I guess, of a room's acoustics. The first one is the reverberation time. And this has to do with the amount and the duration. So how many times are those waves bouncing around from wall to wall? And if it's too long, the reverberation's too long, then that's when the sound gets muddy and we start having that destructive interference, right, that we talked about with those 2 discs. And if it's too short, right, then the sound falls flat and doesn't sound as rich as it could with some indirect. So the point is some indirect is good, but too much is bad, right? And so it's finding the balance there. Intimacy time is the time between the first direct and the first indirect sound, right? So the smaller the room, the more intimate the sound, because the way the walls are closer together, and that's going to increase the time. In a very big room, you don't have intimacy because the walls are farther apart, and that's going to separate the time from the first direct and the first indirect. As I mentioned, high frequency sounds get absorbed more by surfaces, and so rooms have a bass factor, which is basically how much more are the bass being represented in the indirect sound compared to the bass in the direct sound, based on the absorption properties of that room. And then finally, the spaciousness factor is sort of a measurement of how much indirect sound you're getting versus direct sound, right? So when you have that cavernous sort of echo, that's a lot of spaciousness factor, because you're getting a lot more. The fraction of sound that is indirect is much greater than the fraction of sound that's direct. All right. So going back to this. So you remember J.J. Gibson. What did J.J. Gibson study? Or do you remember J.J. Gibson? What was J.J. Gibson? physiological approach to vision we talked about?
The airplane stuff?
The airplane stuff, right? He was the one that was interested in understanding how optic flow worked in order to help pilots better land planes, right? And so he, again, his importance there, the thing you want to associate with these names, Gabbard and Gibson, the two Gs, is they were studying things out in the environment, ways to apply what we know about vision or apply what we know about hearing to our environment. And so Gabbard was the one that really came up with this auditory stream segregation. What are the heuristics that we use in order to focus our attention on a single source here and not be interfered with all the other human voices that are in a packed restaurant area like that. All right, so we have some heuristics. And so based solely on sounds, we can identify some things. So tell me what you think this sound is. What about this sound? What are those sounds? Beat? Running. So one's running upstairs and one's running downstairs. Can you tell which is going up and which is going down?
That's down. That's down. That's upstairs.
It's actually backwards. But the point is, and so my experiments don't work all the way. But we can tell, we have heuristics of what somebody running on the stairs sounds like. And no one ever sat you down and said, hey, pay attention to this, you need to be able to identify this. It just happens through the fact that we have heard these sounds over and over again, right? So some of the things that humans are really good about is if we hear something splash in a cup of water, we know about how big the thing was that you dropped in that water. We actually know how water sounds based on the size of objects, right? People are pretty good at being able to tell the gender of somebody who's just by their footsteps because people walk with different sorts of patterns, right? And then Gabbard Stacey found some things that people found a hard time identifying. So see if you can identify. So people often confuse those two, and they kind of have similar sound properties. The first is a filing cabinet closing, and then the second is bowling, right? So the more similar sounds are, and the less familiar we are with them, right, the harder it is to identify those. If you've never been bowling before, then you probably would have a hard time identifying that sound because you haven't been exposed to it, right? But you probably don't have to see a bowling alley in a TV show or a film or go to one very many times, maybe only once, to encode that as a heuristic of, oh, I know that sound, right? All right, so all of these perceptions are based on heuristics. And the heuristics, some of them we've already talked about, right? So the location of a sound is a heuristic we use to know that those frequencies belong together because they're all originating from the same source, from the same place, right? So you think about it in that crowded bar, if you're focusing on the conversation with the person right in front of you, the frequencies that are coming in from other sources, we're tuning those out with our attention with the auditory stream segregation because of the location. Onset and offset and timbre, we talk about those when we talk about music, right? And so sounds that start and stop together belong together. Right? And the pattern of the harmonics and the attack and delay help group sounds together. So, think about if you go to hear a symphony perform, you can hear the drums and the violins and the horns and the different instruments are all playing at the same time, but they're in different locations, they have different timbre, they have different onset and offset for each note that they're playing, and that helps us identify and organize those sounds. All right. Similarity of pitch. So sounds with similar frequencies, we group together. So the more similar the frequencies, we group those together. So here, we have alternating low and high notes. These notes are low and high. But when we play this melody, what is your perception of that? Are you hearing them alternate back and forth, or are you hearing them grouped together by similarity? So we tend to hear these bass notes. We hear this dun 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 dun, and then the bass notes, they are alternating, right? But we're grouping them as this low group of notes being played in between this high group of notes. Right? And we tend to focus on the higher tone than the lower tone as the melody. That's it. Right? All right, so sounds that occur in rapid succession together belong together. So here, so we're alternating again, but there's a melody that's coming out, right? And if we speed that up, so when it's slowed down, there's not as much grouping as there is. Then when it's sped up, those sounds separate and it becomes like two melodies that are playing. All right, so that's temporal proximity. We also have good continuation. So what is your perception of this? Your perception probably is of this and of this, of two sounds coming together and meeting and then going back up, as opposed to an X, right? And starting low and going high. And again, it's for all those reasons of similarity as opposed to, we don't hear it going up and down, we hear them coming together and going apart. And again, that's because these notes are more similar, right? These notes are more similar, and it's good continuation to keep those together based on their similarity, right? So, so we have good continuation as well. The last one is melody schema. So these are not great examples, I apologize, but that's what I have. The first song here, see if you can tell what song this is. Yeah, or Three Blind Mice, right? Do y'all get that? What about the second one? So this is Mary Had a Little Lamb. Spoiler alert. All right, hence is Three Blind Mice. And then this last thing that's definitely not going to play is if we, and you group those together as melody schemas. They're songs that you know, they're melodies that you know, and you recognize them. If we play the notes, every other note, we can't separate them out. We lose that melody schema, and it actually becomes a new melody. Right? So there's limits to our ability to do this auditory segregation. auditory stream segregation. If you've never heard Marietta Little Lamb or Three Blind Mice, then you won't have a schema for that, and you won't recognize that tune. You'll have to learn it, and so experience is necessary for you. All right, last thing in this, and then we'll start talking about speech.
I want to talk about the shepherd tone. It's a sound made out of multiple sine waves that play a trick on us. See, what they do is continuously rise in pitch, and then every so often one of them drops down an octave. But our brains don't perceive that because the other two continue rising and cover for it. The sine waves take turns dropping down an octave, producing a sonic barber pole, a noise that appears to keep rising in pitch forever and ever without ever actually going anywhere.
Yes, something like that. So it keeps dropping down an octave like you showed those arrows moving on.
This week by fallingfalling.com, a creation image, and then every so often one of them
But we don't
drops down an
detect
octave.
that drop down because these are mass units essentially, and so it's just
The
continuously
sine waves
rising.
take turns dropping down an octave, producing a sonic barber pole, a noise that appears to keep rising in pitch forever and ever without ever actually going anywhere. I was reminded of it this week by fallingfalling.com, a creation of internet artist New Raphael, where the shepherd tone seems to go down and fall forever. Raphael also makes other cool sites like outinthewind.com. Here, there's nothing except for this menacing wind that slowly erodes the cursor. Some of you may already know this, but in America, we say Adidas, whereas the rest of the world says Adidas. And no, it does not stand for All Day I Dream About Soccer. That's just an acronym made up for a word that already exists. Instead, it's named.
All right, so this is a good lead-in into, and I think this is funny, so that's going to take a minute. But a good lead into speech and how we can have a word like Adidas or Adidas that is pronounced in different ways depending on your culture or where you're from or how you learned that word.
After a person, which is why people pronounce it Adidas. It's named after Adi Dassler, a German guy who got in a fight with his brother. So his brother, Rudolph, went across the river and started his own athletic company known as Puma. That's right, Adidas and Puma came from the same town, from the same family.
All right, did y'all know that? So now you know that piece of trivia. All right, don't get excited. We're going to do speech perception. All right. First thing, if we're going to talk about language, right, we need to understand a little bit about how it's generated and the components of speech, how we produce it. So when I'm talking and I'm creating language, I'm forcing air up through my vocal cords that are vibrating, and I'm putting tension on those to produce different frequencies. And I'm also using a bunch of moving parts called articulators, right? And so we mentioned this before, that why my voice sounds like Dr. Pittman and doesn't sound like Dr. Lefebvre is because we have different vocal tracks, different vocal cords, different nasal spaces, and those produce unique harmonies. Even though we might be saying exactly the same thing, our timbre of our voice, right, is different because of these physiological individual differences, right? And so as this air comes up, it's vibrating around in these cavities and producing those harmonic qualities. Articulators are the moving parts, so our tongue, our lips, and our teeth, and our jaw. And we use those mainly to produce consonants, and we mainly use the vocal cords to produce vowel sounds. So a phoneme is the smallest unit of speech. Right? So these are what we refer to as syllables sometimes. Right? So pa, ba, ma, wa, fa, ba. There's a lot more phonemes than there are letters, right? And these are the smallest units of speech, right? So bit, for example, that word bit it's one syllable, but it has 3 phonemes. Ba, it, right? Ba, it. And we can dramatically change the meaning of that by changing just one of those phonemes, right? So pit, bit, and pit, the only difference is ba and pa. But think about what our brain is doing to understand that difference. It's we would never get those confused, even though it's a very, very small sort of change in sound. Bit and bid, whether the t or the duh is at the end of the sound, changes that meaning of that word. Right? And then if we change the middle one, bat, bid, bit, all of those sound very different, even though we're only changing one phoneme in each place. All right. Vowels tend to come from changing the openness of our throat. So let's go back to this real quick. Everybody say ba, and think about what your lips and tongue are doing. Ba, say fa, fa, fa. Right? So when you say fa, you're putting your bottom lip up under your teeth, right? And dropping it down. And when you say ba, you're closing your lips together and then opening them up to produce those consonants. Right? So for vowels, we're changing the shape and the size. So let's do O. So O, and ah. O, ah. So O, we actually make a circle with our mouth, right? It has a different frequency too, but what our articulators are doing is different, right? And none of those are closing, right? Ah, we're flattening and widening our mouth. So there's a difference in both frequency and in how we're changing the shape of our mouth to produce those phonemes. All right, we're ready to done. All right, we're ready. So that's fine. Okay, so there's a lot of things that influence our patterns of tones. So we can have accents, right? And the accents can be so strong that sometimes it's difficult to understand someone, even though they're speaking the same language, right? We can have pronunciation. We can have if you're wearing a mask or not, and if that's muffling the sound. And there's all sorts of things that interfere with our ability to understand language. So if we take the sentence, what are you doing, right? And we look at each one of those words in a sound spectrum, right? What are you doing, right? Come on, say that real loud.
What are you doing?
All right, but say this, like if you're asking me this question.
Just, what are you doing?
Yes, right? So very different if you just ask me the question,
What are you doing?
and you were to pronunciate each one, right? And so this is what our ears hear for what are you doing. If we say that we're actually not producing what are you doing, right? We're shortening things, we're dropping phonemes, right? But again, I'm sort of getting at the marvel of how our brain can do this speech perception is even with something that looks really different, a computer would have a hard time looking at this and saying that's the same meaning as this, right? The patterns are very different. But we don't hear them as different if I say, what are you doing? And what are you doing? Right? The meaning is identical for those two. All right. So even the order of phonemes influences the pattern of those frequencies. So here we have did and do. The difference between that first duh, right, did and do, is the phoneme that follows it, id and oo, right? And so the question is then, are these Ds identical? And it turns out they're not. When we say did, it's going from a low frequency to a high frequency, did. And when we say do, because we're going to a lower frequency, the does actually start out at a different place. So the production of these phonemes is influenced by the other phonemes associated with them. Right? All right. So we've talked about left hemisphere for language, right hemisphere for music perception. When you have both of those present, they're activating the left and the right hemisphere. Right hemisphere is also doing a lot of sound localization stuff, so there's a lot going on with them, right? So when we have speech present, right, we're stimulating both ears typically, sounds coming in and going to both auditory cortices, and then going to getting funneled over to Wernicke's area. We talked about the chimeras dichotic listening as an example of how that happens, right? So we have Wernicke's area back here at the junction of the parietal occipital temporal lobe that's comprehending speech. And then we have the arcuate fasciculus, where it's handing that off. That's a white matter pathway under the sensory and motor cortices to a specialized premotor area called Broca's area. All right? All good on this? Okay. So here's an example looking down and seeing both Wernicke's area and Broca's area being active, and this pathway would be the arcuate fasciculus between those two, right, during a verbal description, right? Here's activation of Wernicke's area in this case. I think this is top and this is bottom. So this is Wernicke's area on the left. For visual stimuli and auditory stimuli. So not only does language, spoken language, heard language, go to Wernicke's area, but when you're reading letters in absence of sound, those complex shapes of the letters is coming out of your V2, V3 pathway and getting routed to Wernicke's area for language comprehension. So we have two pathways for language. We can start in the auditory cortex on both sides and route it over, or we can start in the visual cortex in both occipital lobes and route those patterns over. So when visual patterns are recognized as language, they get sent to Wernicke's area for language comprehension. All right. The association cortices, like the angular gyrus around Wernicke's area, are helping put meaning with those sounds that are recognized as language or those words that are recognized as language. And then finally, Broca's area for language output is not just if you're doing language output. It also is helping with some of the comprehension of sort of grammatical structure, if you will. So that's sort of how you assemble language grammatically is going on in Broca's area. But if you were listening to the lecture and you are typing notes, right, with both hands, then from Broca's area, we're sending language out that you're typing to both of your hand motor cortexes on both sides. If you're taking notes with your right hand, what part of the brain is being activated? If you're listening to a lecture and you're writing notes with your right hand, what is the output? The left hand motor cortex, right? Which is right, not by accident, close by to where Broca's area is. Well, what if you're left-handed and you're writing notes with your left hand? You're right. Yeah, so there we have to send the output through the corpus callosum over to the left hand motor cortex. And in fact, people that are left-handed on average have about 10% bigger corpus callosums than people who are right-handed. And we think this is because of this extra pathway that's needed to send things over to that hemisphere, because language is such an important part of our processing. All right. So we have motor output. And so if I'm speaking, right, then I'm going to the mouth areas of both sides of my brain in order to generate those patterns. All right, so we've already it's nice that we're doing this with the auditory stream, because when we talk about auditory stream segregation, we're talking about there's lots of interference, there's lots of influences on our speech perception. So speech is much, much more than just a frequency analysis of the firing of the auditory cortex. I mean, that's part of it, for sure. But it's a lot more than just that. Okay? So, who can tell what that sentence is? Raise your hand when you know what that says. Everybody doesn't have it yet? Okay. So what does it say? Right? So you can read that even though half of the letters are missing. 50% of the letters are missing, right? But you recognize the pattern and it's a heuristic. It's something you've heard before, something that you're expecting, right? We don't even need that heuristic. Language is so, our brain's ability to overcome interference with language is so powerful that you don't even need that heuristic to do it. So read this out loud. Read that out loud. Right? So even though almost every word in that paragraph is misspelled, right? You're able to very easily recognize the words and comprehend what is being communicated. Right? So this is an example, and that has no heuristic associated with it. You weren't expecting to read that, right? All right. So why do we have this ability? Because unlike vision, right, where we can have visual interference, right, but then something has to be obstructing something for us not to see, right? But with sound, because these sounds are constantly, environmental sounds and other streams are constantly activated at the same time, our brain has found a way to single out language and use context of language in order to not have speech degradation. So actually, people, if we take a speech and we just put static bursts into it and obstruct percentages of it, we can obstruct almost 20% or 80% and only have 20% of the speech being played, and the person can comprehend 50% of what's being said. And if we go to 50%, right, we can understand almost everything that was said in that speech. We might miss out on some things, but we'll understand almost everything. So again, speech's perception is really resistant to degradation because we're constantly not hearing all the frequencies, because we're constantly having frequencies dropped or interfered with by other sounds. All right. All right, so I'm going to play you a sentence, and there's a word in the sentence that has a static burst over it. And I just want you to write down what the word is that's masked. Okay?
It was found that the seal was on the orange.
Okay, everybody got the word? You want to play it again?
It was found that the seal was on the orange.
All right, what about this one?
It was found that the wheel was on the axle. It was found that the wheel was on the axle.
All right, what about the last one?
It was found that the wheel was on the shoe. It was found that the wheel was on the shoe.
All right, so what's the first word? Peel. It was found that the peel was on the orange. What's the second word? Wheel was on the axle. And what's the last word? Heel, right? So, what I actually said in each of those sentences was it was found that the meal was on the orange, it was found that the meal was on the axle, it was found that the meal was on the shoe, right? Does that make any sense to you that that word is in that sentence? No, because we have an expectation of an association of that word with the thing that came later, right? So when we're listening to speech, right, your brain is constantly holding on to the last context and looking for the next context in order to help you perceive what words were being said, right? So there's anticipation of what should be said based on that context, that expectation, right? All right. All right, so we're constantly storing sort of incomplete. The first time you heard that, it was found that the blank was on the, you had to wait for that very last word, orange, in order to go back and make sense of that. And once you did that once, the second time I played it, you actually heard peel because you expected it to be there. Whereas the very first time you heard it, it was difficult to anticipate. All right, so someone tell me what this means.
Euthanasia. Euthanasia.
So what does that mean?
Big something down.
Huh?
Big dog.
You're thinking what?
It's like putting a dog down.
Like putting a dog down humanely? Euthanizing? Right? Did everybody hear that? Euthanasia? Because what I was really saying was kids in Taiwan. I was saying euthanasia. Right? So those frequencies of euthanasia and euthanasia are indiscriminable to our brain. Like the frequencies are identical for euthanasia and euthanasia. I'm saying two different things. I'm saying 3 words the first time and 1 word the second time. Euthanasia, euthanasia. Right? It's the context of how that's used, right, that's going to allow your brain to interpret it. And out of context, you don't have a way of interpreting that correctly. Right? Okay. All right. No. This is no bueno. Everything's going wrong today. Let me see if I can find this. Oh no, I have another slide. We don't need this. All right. So listen to this and tell me what you hear. Maybe this. That is worse. Okay.
Eking. Bar, 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 bar. What do you hear? If you heard bar, 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 you'd be right. But how about now? Bar, 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 bar. Chances are you heard far, bar, bar this time with an.
Did everybody hear that?
If
Okay.
you look away, it sounds like bar.
All right, close your eyes.
You'd be right. But how about now? Bar, bar, bar,
Open your eyes.
bar, bar, bar. Chances are you heard far, far, bar this time with an F, except you didn't. In fact, the audio didn't even change between the 2 videos. Bar, 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 Strange as it may seem, what you hear depends on which video you're looking at. Go ahead, take turns watching each video and see how the sound morphs.
Bar, bar.
This is a perfect example of something called the McGurk effect, which shows how our visuals can alter what we believe we're hearing.
All right, so do that exercise again. You look at the left.
Bar, bar.
If you look here, you hear bar. But if you look here,
bar, bar,
you hear far. Right? The only sound that's being done there is bar, over and over and over again, right? So the other McGurk effect that I was going to show you that didn't work, right, is the audio is ba, 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 ba. But if the lips say ba, va, va, ga, that's what you hear, right? Even though the only phoneme that's present is ba, 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 ba. Why is that? It's the same thing as the McGurk effect on the next slide. Why is that? Would you expect that? It's a strong effect, right? You can't look at this and hear bar. You hear far. You can't not hear far when you see this, right? So what does that tell you about how we perceive language and speech? What?
Like your previous experience with speech and seeing how people like enunciate and pronounce words over time affects how you would perceive other.
Yes, because when our brain sees this, right, the fact that this is an F making phony movement, right, our brain says my visual system won't lie to me, right? My auditory system gets interfered with all the time. But if I'm looking at someone's lips and I see them make that movement, I know what phoneme that is, even though it's not physically, the frequency isn't physically there, right? So we actually trust our vision a lot more because it's not being interfered with, and there's a good chance that the frequencies could be interfered with by other things. Right? And you guys are good sports. Just a little bit more on pages. Top down and let's go to pages. All right. So we have all these top-down influences to help us with speech perception. Speech perception is so important to us. It's so important to us that we have developed non-auditory cues to help us understand speech. We use context. We have anticipation and expectations of what we are expecting to hear. All of that helps us not interpret speech incorrectly. All right, so I want to end by talking about aphasias, right? Let's go pull up all these words. So an aphasia is a language problem. And Wernicke's aphasia is where that Wernicke's area is damaged, and so we have difficulty with comprehension. It's also called fluent aphasia because patients can have the language production facilities are fine, and they can talk, but they often will not be accurate in the production because they don't have the feedback to comprehend what they're saying. All right? So they'll inappropriately insert words into sentences, and they don't realize that they're doing it. And depending on, and so these aphasias are most often caused by strokes, and every stroke produces unique damage. And so the more damage there is, the more deficits there are, and the less damage, you can have very specific sorts of deficits. So I'm hoping that this works. This is a woman that
We're a
has...
little earlier. We're coming over to English.
This is a woman that has a mild case of Wernicke's aphasia.
One of your wonderful trips. And I just wondered whether you could tell me a little bit about it again.
Well, we tired it very good to go. It wonderful, but it was very good.
Did you go far away from here?
Yes, we went a long way of that, downside, inside, outside.
Did you go someplace that was in the southern hemisphere?
Yes, I did, and it was wonderful.
Okay. Did you go to Antarctica?
Yes, we did.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Okay. That wasn't what I really had.
I know it was a wonder. We were there, and then we can, you know.
Can you say the name of the place you were?
Oh, I can't, but inside.
Well, what you said to me on the way over here that was real good was you called it Down Under.
Yes, okay, time. Girl in time. The girl child or other thing.
Okay, I'm going to say it for you.
Okay,
see whether you can
please.
say it after me. You went to Australia.
Yes, I did.
Okay, can you say that?
I went to the Pedler time.
Okay, Australia.
In April time.
It's pretty hard for me to do that.
Yes, it is very hard.
And when we were getting ready to start this videotape, the producer asked us to count to 10. Remember that?
Yes.
Can you do that again?
Why? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. Boy, 2, Gabriel's, people, go, I can't.
No, that's really hard. Let me get you started.
I was on.
Okay. 1,
1, 2, 4, 5, 6, better cent, point.
Good enough. Let's
Is that all right?
That's fine.
All right. So that gives you an example of how someone's not able to comprehend what they're saying. They don't have the feedback, and so they're saying words inappropriately. They don't even realize that they're saying those words. Or, like in the case of trying to say the word Australia, that was a particular thing that she couldn't understand. She would say Antarctica. She knew kind of what she was trying to say. Again, the production side is fine, but it's the comprehension that is the problem. And then we can contrast that with Broca's aphasia, right, which is where people have problems. They can comprehend just fine, but they have problems with production and getting it out.
If you get like one of these or Broca's without having any like an illness or like just naturally happen?
No, I mean, you have to have some sort of trauma to that part of the brain. So some stroke event is usually what causes it. But it can be isolated where you don't have other deficits. So this is an example of Broca's aphasia.
I understand you don't want me to call you Mr. McNew anymore.
No,
What do you want me to call you?
Earl.
All right, I will, but only if you call me Nancy.
Okay.
What are you gonna call me?
Nancy.
Good.
So his Broca's aphasia, if you were to talk with him like this, he seems pretty normal because he's able to do like one word at a time, right? Call me Nancy. What are you going to call me? Nancy. He didn't say, I'm going to call you Nancy. It wasn't a full sentence, but he said, okay. He said, no. He said, Nancy. All right?
Okay, here's the story. While the lady was shopping, her wallet fell out of her purse, but she didn't see it fall. When she got to the checkout counter, she had no way to pay for the groceries. So she put her groceries away and went home. Just as she opened the door to her house, the phone rang and a little girl told her she had found her wallet. The lady was very relieved. All right, now you tell me the story.
All right, so he can comprehend all of that. He heard the story, he knows the story, right?
Okay. One of them is for someplace, and in a grocery store, and he
see, he can comprehend himself making the mistakes. And it's very frustrating and invokes a lot of anxiety in people that have Broca's aphasia, and in a lot of people develop depression because they feel like they're trapped in their head and they can understand what people are saying, but they can't communicate back to them.
And the ring and ring.
See, he knows it's a telephone. He's doing the sign for telephone, but he can't get it out.
The girl, maybe. And they had lost billfold.
So you can see how hard it is when he's trying to, he heard the story, and now he's trying to process and get it out. In a second, she's going to ask him a question, and he's just going to kind of answer off the cuff where he doesn't really have to think about the production, and you can see the sort of difference in that.
And she was very, very glad.
Has that ever happened to you? Lost your wallet?
I think one time, long time ago.
Right? So that was very different. He said, I think one time, a long time ago. Right? Still, you can tell that there's a deficit. I mean, he's not stringing together complex sentences. But very different if he just sort of responds versus tries to formulate language. I'm going to remember this story and tell it. Yes?
If he was to sign, like, using sign language, would he be able to process like a whole sentence that way?
No, he wouldn't be able to write it out if she asked him to write out the story. He wouldn't be able to do that. The language production center Broca's area is damaged, and so it's the ability to make language. Yes? Carol, did you have a question? No. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to do all this. Like, she shows him a cartoon, and he has to like describe. And anyway, all right. But that gives you an example of this. So in terms of, and you can also have conductive aphasia. Conductive aphasia where that pathway between the two gets damaged. And that, with conductive aphasia, you have the best outcome because all you have to do, the two centers that are doing most of the work, the comprehension and the production, are intact. We just have to find a way for them to communicate with each other, right? So when the wire is broken, essentially, the prognosis is the best because we just have to find another pathway through rehabilitation to connect those two areas. There's no functionality that's been lost, right? Broca's aphasia has better outcome than Wernicke's aphasia for the simple fact that in Wernicke's aphasia, it's often very difficult for patients to participate in language rehabilitation, as we saw with the lady in the clip, because they can't understand what they're supposed to be doing in the speech rehabilitation. Right? They're having a hard time comprehending the instructions, and they're having a hard time hearing the problem, so they can't correct it. Right? Broca's aphasia, because they can understand the instructions, actually has the better outcome of the two. All right?
I hope that I can be a living example of how much power music has.
So this is a gentleman who had major stroke, Broca's aphasia, couldn't speak at all. And through a process called melodic intonation, where he learned how to sing, because singing and music is more on the right side of the brain, he was able to harness the right side of the brain that was not damaged, right? And use that to now regain his ability to speak. So we're going to watch this, and then we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll do that, okay? We're right there.
Let's discuss what aphasia really is. It's a problem one has that is associated my stroke 5 years ago. Let me tell you a little story about aphasia. One day I was on my way to therapy at Rusk, and I stopped into a little deli.
I think this is I won't quit interrupting, I promise. But I think that this is a great analogy of what it's like to have Broca's aphasia, because literally stroke events happen, right? And you wake up from this traumatic thing that happened, and all of a sudden your world has changed. What your brain can do is different now, in the blink of an eye, sort of.
I stop there every day to get some coffee before my therapy session. It was run by Brazilians who had a rather heavy Portuguese accent. One day, they said to me, "Excuse me, but we don't know where you're from." They couldn't tell what country my voice accent was from. So I looked them squarely in the eye, and I said, "I'm from aphasia." You know, it's a little country of South America down there. But what is it really like to be from the country of aphasia? Your mind and your mouth don't match. You are afraid to order in a restaurant. The telephone rings, you are afraid. The doorbell rings, you are afraid. You cannot tell the ones you love how much you love them.
So this gets at some of the anxiety and depression that happens with us.
You lost most of the skills you used to have. Computers, driving, these skills are gone. Innovation. There are not many resources in the country of Asia. Once you're there, that's where you are. There are no planes to get out of aphasia. There are no boats to take us away from aphasia. You just wake up one morning and there you are in the country of aphasia. You are there for life until there's a cure for aphasia. But there is hope. There is hope. By the great work of speech language pathologist who can help us learn how to communicate with each other. there are researchers and scientists like Dr. Sean Galong. There is hope. They are trying to break down the walls of a country of Asia for all of us. I couldn't speak for 2 years. At first, the right side of my body was paralyzed. I went to therapy 3 times a week. I just couldn't complete thoughts. I used my eyes to blink yes and no.
That was his level of ability to communicate.
Then one day, my therapist said to me, let's try tapping and singing. And it worked. For the first time in 2 years, I sang Happy Birthday. You see, I was learning how to use the right side of my brain. The left side had been so seriously damaged by the stroke. The language center in my left side. Now, I was, in fact, using the right side of my brain to sing. How is that possible? I couldn't speak, but I could sing. I learned to transfer the thoughts and speech through music, and that is called melodic intonation therapy. I could not speak, but I could sing. Now tell me, does music have power or not?
All right, so that's an example of how someone can now communicate. They had to reprogram his brain. It took him 2 years of therapy, of blinking yes or no, before they were able to have that breakthrough with singing Happy Birthday. And then it took him another 3 years to learn how to take the thoughts he had of language in his right brain and sing them in that Happy Birthday melody as a song, and then slowly remove the melody off of the song so that he could speak like that he truly is singing in his head to produce that language. All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break. Lab will not be too long today, and we'll get out of here early. All right, if you don't have SPSS and you need it, that's backwards, guys. I'm sorry.
It is?
Yeah. Is it?
Well, maybe not.
Both sides are backwards. That's not.
It's actually kind of way underneath of it. Oh.
And I'm sorry to be your answer. Okay, I'm glad you got it.